Welcome to Spaced Out. I'm your host Sarah Begum, and this week is a Sex in Space special. My guest this week, Dr. Simon Dube, is a PhD candidate in psychology at Concordia University in Montreal. He specializes in human sexuality, technology, and aerobotics, or the study of human-machine erotic interactions. His work also explores the challenges and possibilities related to our intimate lives beyond our home planet, and argues that we need to scientifically study space sexology to mitigate risks as we journey to the final frontier. Welcome to the show, Dr. Dube.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure to have you. So, I'm fascinated by what you do. Like I said, I've been really looking forward to this episode to learn more about it, because yours is the first I've come across regarding any topic of conversation of sex in space. You wrote a piece for The Conversation titled Sex in Space: Could Technology Meet Astronauts' Intimate Needs? Where you proposed that sex, technology, or sex tech, could be used to fulfill some of the emotional and sexual needs of astronauts during long-term space missions. So I'd love to know, what is sex tech and how does it work?
Yeah, so sex tech, like you said, sexual technology or sex technology is the compression of these two terms, and it's a very broad term. Okay, it just means not only the industry but products that intersect human sexuality and technological products. So it can go from sex toys, but also different connected technology, immersive products like immersive virtual reality, mixed reality, augmented reality, and of course also, when we enter the realm of erobotics, we enter the realm of eros and bot, so erotic agents. So we enter the realm of a scientific field that intersects human-machine interaction and sexology. So here really the realm of what happens when human starts to engage with virtual partners, erotic chatbots, sex robot, but also starts to augment themselves using various products that use, for instance, artificial intelligence, which may include, to a certain extent, dating applications and also augmented partners.
Can you please explain the significance of aerobotics?
Yeah, so aerobotics, the term comes from eros, like erotic.
Yeah, Eros is the god of sex or love, right?
Yes, exactly. And botics, or bot, so agent. So it's a portmanteau. When we talk about eros bot, we're talking about all kinds of artificial, embodied or virtual artificial erotic agents, such as, like I said, erotic chatbots, virtual partners, sex robots, but also AI-powered dating application, AI matchmakers, every form of erotic technology that employs some form of agential products that you can use for yourself in your intimate life. So their erotic capabilities can be designed, so implemented in the technology from the get-go, but also learn over time through interaction with humans.
That classifies as sex tech.
The term sex tech, again, is very broad and also distinct from aerobotics to a certain extent, but sex tech is usually defined describes three things: the products that can be used in human sexuality, but it also describes sometimes the industry and the ventures that aim to design these products and enhance human well-being or human capabilities and possibilities. So when we talk about sex tech, we're talking about the products themselves and an industry. Usually the terms are used sometimes interchangeably, but when we talk about the products more specifically, we can think obviously about vibrators, dildos. These are usually the first thing that comes in mind, fleshlights. So, but more and more, sex tech is also technology that enables you to connect with other people. It includes teledildonics, immersive erotic video games, teledildonics. So these, for instance, connected sex toys and smart sex toys that you can use at a distance with your partners.
I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah, we have more and more sexual technology and sex tech. For instance, vibrators that can be connected through the internet and your phone, so that you can have remote erotic interaction with partners. So sex tech is a very broad term.
Is this limited to space and astronauts, or?
Of course not. Actually, at this point in time, we're not even talking about sex tech in space. To our knowledge, there's no form of sex tech that has been used in space context. However, sex tech is a huge industry and a very rapidly growing industry that is partly led by a lot of also women founders and LGBTQ founders and CEOs. So recently, we're also, as we journey and move towards more long-duration space flight and potentially exploring the possibility of colonizing new planets and our natural satellite, the moon, we need to be thinking about solutions to probably enable some form of sexual outlet or sexual experiences for people who are going to live outside of our own planet. So when we think about these solutions and these very artificial environments such as spaceships, stations, and base, we need to be thinking of probably technological solutions to enable these forms of human eroticism in space. So this is where sex tech could probably either meet some of our sexual needs, and using erobotics or erobots, so artificial erotic agents in virtual or immersive experience, maybe also offer opportunity to have more emotional and intimate connection with artificial partners when, for instance, maybe a relationship with a crew member might not be advisable.
So, are you aware of any sex technology being used in space already? Have any astronauts come to you and confided in you about their sexual needs and sex technology, or have they had sex in space?
Absolutely not. Nothing about sex in space, and definitely nothing about the use of sex tech in space. This is actually why we're asking some of these questions. This is why we need space sexology, because to us it seems who are psychology students and PhD candidates and researchers in psychology and human sexuality, it's obvious that human eroticism is central to our life, and that we're going to take this part of our existence into space as we go there for long periods of time. So at this point in time, national space agencies and private companies, they're publicly saying that sex never happened in space, and that a lot of them have no plan to study it other than looking at the reproduction of other mammalians, or for instance, or doing experiments in simulated environments here on Earth, using mostly non-animal human models, so rats, mice, birds, fish, insects.
Same feeling, is it?
But we're far from having any form of complex and interactive technology or really form of human eroticism in space at this time. And this is actually a problem. We need to be addressing this right now. We need to be conducting research with astronauts who are going to space, who have been to space. But it comes with a lot of challenges, because obviously these space agencies don't want to talk about sex. So we need to some extent bring that to them and make them realize and make the public realize that this is an important issue. We have anecdotal evidence, though, that some of these astronauts who reported that they experienced some form of sexual deprivation after so they were missing the intimacy, and they were definitely having sexual responses. So we have very courageous astronauts who publicly said that, for instance, they experienced erections and they experienced arousal in space. So we can obviously expect that these physiological responses also come with sexual thoughts, and they're humans, okay? They're humans with needs, and that needs to be addressed. It's not such a problem if people go for a couple of weeks
Mm.
People, I think, can sustain some form of abstinence and celibacy for a couple of weeks, but it's really another issue when first the duration augments. So if we start thinking about months, years, and more in terms of space duration and space flight or living in space, but also if to some extent we want to colonize other planets, this will have to be an issue that is addressed, and not in terms of only reproduction, but also thinking more holistically about sexology, so gender diversity, sexual orientation, pleasure, intimate relationships, breakups, interpersonal conflict, sexual harassment, all of these things.
So I'm interested to know if any astronauts have spoken to you about their sexual responses in space, and if so, would you know what happens to some men in zero gravity?
Yeah. Yeah, obviously.
Sorry, I'm sure everyone wants to know this.
Of course, yeah. Obviously, in complete total weightlessness, very interesting happens to bodily fluid, including blood and semen. So, well, semen, if we're talking about this, really, it bubbles like other fluid. I mean, yeah, it creates small bubbles if there's form of ejaculations in space. But again, so it needs to be contained to some extent, because in the artificial environments, you want to keep this very hygienic and safe. So like sweat, blood, and other bodily fluid, semen would bubble in space. In weightlessness.
Safely ejaculate in space?
It's actually a very big question, and we need to actually be studying these questions. It might not be as easy as we think to ejaculate in space, because not only in terms of the physiological response, but the way the contractions and blood flows to the penis in space might actually make it a bit harder to actually ejaculate. But if we do, yes, we need to be considering that this might actually make it a bit more difficult for reproduction, because as a species, we fully evolved in an environment where gravity was extremely important. We adapted our sexuality and reproduction to that environment. So I think, again, to some extent, we need to find ways to either tackle weightlessness or create artificial gravity in space or in these environments.
Speaking of which, Vanna Bonter invented the two-suit. Are you aware of that? It's a flight garment designed to facilitate sex in space. What other inventions are there to initiate sex in space?
Yeah, absolutely. The two-suit is one of the great example, I think, of practical yet simple device that we should be thinking about to enable forms of eroticism and maybe sexual partners, sexual interaction in space. There are not a lot out there from either the agencies, again, talking about solutions, but I've talked to some researchers in areas that are somewhat related, and they are thinking of devices like harness, straps to bring partners together, because obviously in zero gravity,
What's the harness strap?
For instance, a form of harness that could keep partners together. Harness, yes, exactly.
Like harness, is that like something else? Never mind.
Yeah, so yeah, exactly. But that is the kind of practical solution that we should be thinking about. We should also be thinking about how to create privacy in these environments. How we could probably make some of these the capsule where astronauts sleep more adapted to eroticism. We should probably also be thinking of sex tech, again, like I said, some form of technology that could maybe contain semen, that could be easily cleaned, that could provide vibration and pleasure like here on Earth, that are small, discreet, and yeah.
What about sleeping bags for two people and like pods for two people?
Exactly, because in space, when you're dealing with weightlessness, now we're talking about for instance, space stations, not like on the moon where there's microgravity, or maybe on Mars where there's a bit more gravity again. But when you're in total weightlessness, you need to be dealing with the fact that each movement that you're taking will push your partner or other form of fluids or response in the opposite direction. Or if you move and you touch a wall or something, you're going to push yourself off of that. So you need to create an environment where people can experience friction and can keep contact with their partners or themselves.
That's so interesting. I mean, how does sex in space work? Like, at the moment, it's not being discussed, as you said, in institutions. It's not being studied the way that you're proposing and you're working on at the moment. So it's just a question that hasn't really been answered yet. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. Not only is it, all of these questions are not being answered, they're not even being addressed. That is actually the problem. That's where we're at right now.
Why is that? Why is this question not being addressed, or this very important topic?
I think one of the important answers is simply inherent conservatism and very traditional values regarding human sexuality. There's definitely stigma and taboo when it comes to sex. And I think a lot of these national space agencies, including NASA, they don't want to touch sex. They don't want to, they're public administrations, and they don't want to be held accountable and deal with that when it comes to their taxpayer and public money. Because some people, yes, sex is taboo. They don't want to deal with that, but and they don't want their tax money to go in, I guess, financing some form of sex studies, but it is actually needed. Now, that being said, there are a lot of studies on reproduction, not only of humans, but can we reproduce outside of space, testing the viability of sperm and eggs in the International Space Station, creating form of simulated environments for micro and hypergravity, like I said, with mammalians or other form of animals, to see if reproduction is possible and what fail-safe or countermeasures or protective measures could be done. There's also a number of studies that look at gender and sex differences and the impact and reaction to space flights and context. So we're looking at how space influences women and female and men and male astronauts. Is it impacting them differently? But sexology is more than that. It's more than reproduction and gender sex differences. We need to be thinking of questions like I said, sexual orientation, preferences, pleasure, consent. We need to be thinking about issues of sexual harassment, violence, and abuse in confined environments. We need to think practically on how to enable space eroticism from reproduction to pleasure and intimate relationships.
You mentioned reproduction, and obviously if people start having sex in space, this will inevitably lead to potential pregnancies. So I want to know, what are the implications of pregnancy in zero gravity?
Pregnancy is completely counterindicated right now for spaceflight. That's the first thing I'll say. Now, there are a number of non-human animal studies that look at how, for instance, rats would gestate and the fetus development. And for now, I'd say it's not very encouraging in weightlessness. The fact is, weightlessness changes bodily fluids, and for instance, how blood and nutrients come to the fetus. There's also obviously radiation and other issues that increases the chance of cancer development or malformation in embryonic development. So there's a lot of countermeasure that needs to be put in place to actually enable safe pregnancy. Like I said, right now it's completely counterindicated, and in the near future, I don't see any form of human pregnancy in space. For now, giving the risk that it represents, it would be an important risk and danger for the mother and the development of the baby and child. So I think when it comes to, if your question is about weightlessness in particular, I think we need to be considering ways of developing artificial gravity, so rotational gravity, for instance, and maybe experience what it would be like on microgravity on the moon and Mars, where the gravitational conditions are a bit more similar to what you would find on Earth, but still probably not enough to sustain a full gestation.
Why is it important to discuss sex in space, and how will this help facilitate our dreams of becoming an interplanetary species by populating other planets?
Excellent question. I think that is one of the most important questions that we should be addressing publicly. Human life is conditioned before, during, and after by sexuality. It's inherent. It's not only a need, but it's also a very pleasurable and positive aspect of human existence when it's done safely and ethically and consensually. So I think it's not only important for the reproduction component, so if we want to thrive and survive on other world, but it's also important because it's a fulfilling and meaningful aspects of human existence. It's also probably a very important aspect to make people's space journey enjoyable, to also create strong bonds and pleasurable interaction with crew members or people that you live with. It also presents a risk, actually, if we prevent it. If we start preventing the expression of human eroticism in space, we might deal with other forms of problem like depression, anxiety, stress. It might create tension between crew members or co-workers. You might also be increasing risk of form of harassment and aggressivity in an already very dangerous environment where cooperation is very important. So why do we need to address sex in space? Because it's important to human existence, but also because if we don't, this is going to be leading to other very problematic risks in space. And the last reason why we need to be thinking about this is because sex has a lot of benefits. Okay, it's good for our health in general. It can help reduce stress, help sleep, alleviate pain. It can there's a number of studies that suggest that it can help with blood pressure, with cancer. It's also good for body image or sexual empowerment, and obviously our sexual health in general and functioning, which is not only good for our moral, but also to reproduction in new worlds. So I cannot stretch enough how thinking holistically about human sexuality, there's so many levels of how this issue is important. It's just important because it's central to human existence, and we are going to take it in other worlds and space environments. So why not try to make it something positive that mitigate risk and enhance human well-being?
And the flash is, I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer that with 1 or 2 words only. Where do we all come from?
I don't know.
Yes, you do.
I simply don't know. I mean,
we all come from the same place. We all come from the mother's womb.
Okay, I understand your question. If you mean practically, yes. Like I said in just earlier, our life starts with sex.
So, but that's where we come from. We come from the act of sex between 2 people. So that's where we originate, and from a woman's womb. So it would be interesting to know, as we start to venture out to the moon and Mars, whether they'll have more female astronauts or partners, male and female astronaut partners to populate and colonize those planets and moons, etc. But then I have another question. So if they were to get pregnant and have babies, what measures can be taken to ensure that babies survive in space and on other planets?
Okay, so if we're talking about an hypothetical scenario where, first of all the measures were put in place and a fetus survived and a baby survived in weightlessness or under the radiation of space. If for some miracle a person was able to get pregnant and give birth in space environment, which we're not there yet, I mean, we would need to be thinking holistically again about child rearing, which would be a very important issue. So how do we make sure that we shield our colonies from radiations, how we provide them with an education, how we provide all forms of services and medical health that a child needs, but also all the spiritual educational background that a child needs to thrive in this environment and learn and become a multidimensional human being. So again, we need to be thinking holistically, not only about the pregnancy aspect, but the child rearing aspect that comes with it afterwards, which include also teaching parenthood in space contexts and adapting our parenthood techniques to spaceship stations and settlement, which is a very particular challenge as well.
So if a baby were to be born in space and adapt to the conditions of its natural environment, be it the ISS-2, the Moon or Mars, would it be able to survive on Earth?
That's a good question. Again, if we were able to tackle all of the challenges that comes with conception, pregnancy, then child rearing in space, and then bring this child back to Earth, I guess, yes, there would be some form of, if we tackle all of these challenges, I suspect that we would probably be also able to help these children adapt to Earth. But obviously, if we didn't use some form of artificial gravity or some form of physical training, yes, the development in weightlessness or microgravity might become a challenge when someone comes back to Earth and deal with the gravity of our planet. Yet, if we were able to circumvent and tackle all the challenges that comes before, like I said, conception, pregnancy, and child rearing, I guess to some extent at this point, I suspect that we would also be able to help these child born in space adapt to space context. Maybe because we develop some form of artificial or rotational gravity, which makes a child living in space already capable of adapting to some of the Earth context.
Okay, thank you for that. So can intimate relationships between colleagues in space help or hinder the actual missions in space, and how?
We don't know. First, because right now space missions and the National Space Agency are trying to prevent as much as possible any form of intimate relationships between astronauts. But we can take, I think, some form of information from analogous contexts like work environments or confined environments, like in space, in scientific missions in Antarctica, or similar simulated environments in extreme environments. We don't know if it's going to constitute risks or dangers, but I would say that in a working context, for instance, we try to minimize them because it can create problematic power dynamics. For instance, if two people in a relationship are from different ranks, or there's a form of someone is the boss, someone is the leader, and the other person is in a subordinate position when it comes to power structures. The other problem arises when in a very stressful environment there could be conflicts, not only between the person in intimate relationships, which could affect then their performance in the rest of the mission, but also if two people are in an intimate relationships and the rest of the crew kind of perceives that as maybe unfair treatment or biased responses, especially in small groups. But I think we need also to be thinking of what it could bring in terms of benefits. I think intimate relationships are a very good way to form strong bonds. If we live in bigger colonies, we'll have to contend with this, but also these intimate relationships will arise on their own. If you're thinking people with similar interests, with healthy bodies, people will be attracted to one another and form strong intimate bonds. So I think it might be okay right now to restrict it or try to prevent it, but I think it's an unrealistic expectation and arguably unethical in terms of long-term spaceflight. So rather than trying to prevent or prohibit it, I think we should be actually teaching astronauts and also crew members or anyone who's going to live in space for fairly long periods of time how to develop meaningful intimate relations and navigate the complexity of our intimate relationships in space. And these are all the kind of information and questions that could be also useful to Earth context.
Well, you mentioned quite a few of the challenges of having sex in space, but what would you say the most significant challenges would be of having sex in space?
At this point in time, I think gravity is one of the more practical challenge. In terms of the human factor, right now, I think the biggest challenges is making national and private space agency recognize that this is actually an important issue and we need to be addressing it. Then the third challenges, which is also a human challenge, is obviously find ways to make astronauts take part in some form of training, basic hygiene and sex training, that would help them navigate the complexities of sexuality and intimate relationship in space. But again, before all of this is possible, we need to be designing space sexology program to address holistically human sexuality, reproduction, intimate relationship. So I do hope that if any members of these space agencies is listening right now to this podcast, I encourage them to make a show of courage and honesty, because this is what space program and mission requires: courage and honesty to actually address the needs of human, including our intimacy and eroticism.
Well, let's hope they listen and open up an entire department that maybe you could start leading. Wouldn't that be the dream? How can we start a population on the moon or Mars?
Yeah, very important, again, questions and interesting. There's a number of studies related to minimal viable populations. So I think the strategy of space programs and mission is obviously to send as much material and automated system to build the habitats, bring resources, before any humans actually set foot on the moon or Mars again. So the idea is to send rovers to explore, but also to send all kinds of robots to build habitats, try to maximize the use of resources that are on these planets and space environments, then bring some resources to find ways, for instance, to eat, drink, recycle water in these spatial and in these different habitats. And then once this is done, find ways to bring humans in environments that are to some extent already ready to sustain life and they're under very strict human protocols.
You know what would be interesting, and this could be sex technology developed and taken to the next level. So they're sending rovers to Mars for scientific research and exploration, but what if they were able to send these rovers carrying samples of human DNA, for example, semen and an egg or an embryo on the planet to see what happens?
When we talk about, for instance, minimal viable population, so the minimum of individual that you would need to create, obviously, a sustainable colony, but also one that has enough genetic diversity to thrive and survive, we need to be considering bringing eggs and, gametes in general, spermatozoa and eggs, maybe frozen to some extent. And we know that this is to some extent possible on the space station to conserve some of these eggs and maybe eventually implant them. But that again raises a lot of ethical issues about human reproduction and people's will to undergo these kinds of procedures. But yes, the idea of bringing enough genetic diversity through frozen eggs and spermatozoa is a possibility to then perform some in vitro insertion and then ensure that our colony is viable in the long run.
So at the moment, sex isn't permitted on space missions, so how does contraception work in space?
Yeah, so one of the means to control these risks, but it's not only about reproduction, it's also about menstrual cycle. All female astronauts are using contraceptives. and it simply works. It works in space at this point in time. It obviously reduces the risk of not necessarily complication, but I mean just dealing with the menstrual cycles in space mission, but also reduces the risk of unintended and unwanted and unplanned pregnancy, which, like I said, are completely counterindicated right now in space environments. So we could obviously be continuing these process for population regulations in a long-term space colony and space life.
So what psychological processes do astronauts experience in space around sex and intimate relationships? And what strains does this have on the missions?
Again, we don't know much about the intimacy of astronauts because there's virtually no studies that actually deals directly with that. But we have, like I said, indications that some astronauts at least are experiencing sexual deprivation and they're still experiencing sexual desire that are unmet. Now, based on what we know on Earth of involuntary celibacy, involuntary abstinence, I don't think that's a reasonable way of going for long-term space missions. We know that people who are not able to fully experience their sexuality or have some form of sexual outlet or develop intimate relationships with meaningful partners and significant others, it generally increases the risk of depression, anxiety, and stress. People contending with abstinence and celibacy for long periods of time is generally problematic for humans who hold human sexuality and intimate relationships to such high regard in our life. So we can extrapolate some of these ideas to space context and say, well, yeah, that's possible if you're in the space station or base for a couple of weeks. That's one thing. But if it's a question of months and years, I think astronauts right now are highly trained and highly selected and monitored and screened. But this is not necessarily the future of humanity in space. We need to also be thinking about space tourism. So people who go to space for certain periods of time for leisure, people who are doing scientific research on these eventual bases for long periods of time, and eventually settlers as well on other worlds who might not be able to sustain very strict policies of abstinence and celibacy like current astronauts might be able to do. And that's a big if, again, because I suspect that some of these astronauts also are experiencing some form of sexual deprivation that might be stressful. But space endeavors is something greater than life, so they might be willing to contribute to these space mission because they know they are part of something bigger than themselves. But eventually, I don't think we should be imposing these formal or informal policies of abstinence. We should instead be finding ways to make it something safe, pleasurable, consensual, and ethical if we want to ensure the success of space missions.
Okay, and if we did end up populating other planets and places in space, would those humans be an entirely different species?
From a strictly biological perspective, if we think a biological and phylogenical perspective, no. It would take a lot of time for there to be any form of speciation, so the creation of two different species, and it probably in a not so distant future, we'll continue sending humans, for instance, to Mars on our colonies, so people will reproduce with people on Earth. So from a biological perspective, two different species are species that are not able to reproduce with one another, if we take a very strict biological definition. But I would just add that what we can expect, though, rather than two different species, is actually the development of two very distinct societies. Space environments are kind of like micro societies in a micro world. So we can rapidly see the emergence of new societies, cultures with their own norms, views, and practices, including around their eroticism, sexuality, and intimacy.
That's really interesting. Once our human bodies adapt to other environments where there is gravity and oxygen, or even if there isn't as much gravity, but where we can actually start living on other planets, or reproduce oxygen somehow for our survival long term, would the bodies change somehow biologically to adapt to that environment? And then would that then hinder or cause some sort of implications for our ability to adapt and survive on Earth?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure if our body would change, not necessarily on a short period of time, unless we do interventions, some form of genetic interventions, our own body or our embryos to potentially make them more compatible with the new space environments. Again, that raises a lot of ethical questions, whether this is appropriate to tamper with our genetic code to make it possible to adapt to space environment. That's a whole other class of debate. But I'd say that our natural selection works in a way that it's not something, our adaptation to environment is not something that happens in the one generation, unless you make modification on the population directly. It happens over time with reproduction. So maybe if we find environments that more closely relate or are more closely similar to what we can find on Earth, maybe we'll be able to, over generation, better adapt to some environments. I mean, just the color of our skin, our eyes, our morphology has changed over time here on Earth, depending on the environments that our species has expanded to. So if we are able to find space environments that are not too radically different from what you'd find on Earth, yes, I suspect that over generation, there will be a differential reproduction pattern if we don't find ways actually to just directly change our genetic baggage or adaptation at the population and one generation level. But over time, yes, that would be possible. But again, we're in the realm of the very speculative, just based on what we can find here on Earth and our expansion in different environments.
It reminds me of that saying, you hear this in movies, I won't even get with you, even if you were the last man on the planet. It's really funny when you think about it practically, how it should be a solution to us becoming an interplanetary species. It's just really funny. Okay, so what advancements in AI or robots are necessary to develop our sexual relationships in space, and how does your work resolve this?
A lot of advancement when it comes to artificial partners are needed to create a more complex and meaningful relationship, at least for the general public, to develop meaningful relationship with artificial partners. One of the important advancements that will need to happen, I think, to get to the next step where the relationship becomes really interesting and complex and diversified with artificial partner is the development of some form of metacognitive capabilities. So the capacity to learn and reason to reason and theory of mind. So that would enable artificial partners to develop more complex relation with humans. That being said, I think robotics has a lot more to offer than just complex partners. I think if we think about immersive or interactive experience, I think there's already a lot of very advanced and interesting products that exist today that could provide astronauts with sexual outlet, but also connection with partners at a distance, whether that be a loved one on Earth or another crew members, or just immerse themselves in virtual environments or augmented environments where they can experience intimate relationship with one or multiple artificial partners.
What's an artificial partner?
Yeah, so for instance, here a simulated character that is computer generated would be, for instance, erotic chatbots or virtual partners that you can find in erotic video games.
So I can create my own artificial, intelligent, erotic partner if I wanted to?
Yeah, exactly. I think one thing that sex toys cannot meet is human emotional needs.
Mm.
So if we develop more complex and interesting erotic partners, that could help meet some of humans' intimate needs, especially in situations where having a human partners is not necessarily advisable. That happens as well. I think one is not is a complement actually to the other. It's not a complete substitution. We need to be thinking of, yes, how to create meaningful interhuman relationship between crew members or settlers and people living on space station and base. But in the meantime, if that is not possible, we should also be thinking of alternatives. And robotics as a field is thinking of human-machine erotic interaction and studying it and finding ways to understand how we perceive these artificial partners and maybe what we would need to make these relationships more beneficial, meaningful, and ethical, and how eventually maybe we could use and leverage these solutions to help astronauts. So how does my work go into this area? My own doctoral work, because I'm a PhD candidate, is looking at how first humans perceive these technology. Why do they want to have sex and intimate relationship with machines in the first place? And I can tell you right now, it's not just because people are lonely or not able to find intimate partners. It's because they want to experience pleasure, because they're curious, they want to enact their fantasies, but also because they want to diversify their relationship, because for safety reasons, because they want to practice. Some people have experienced trauma, so they want to maybe get acquainted with their sexuality and body in a very controlled environment. So there's all kinds of good reasons for people to desire these artificial partners or immersive experiences, including some that could be leveraged to help meet the needs of astronauts.
I'm shocked why it's not being discussed within space agencies. So this is a question that you're trying to address with your work. And it's very important and it's very necessary as we develop our space missions and as we actually start to populate other planets. What do you think needs to be done right now as a first point of action from within space agencies to address this issue?
First step, fully and publicly recognize the importance of human eroticism in human existence, including in space context. Step 1. Step 2, start to build immediately institutes, departments, programs dedicated to space sexology to address all phenomena related to human eroticism, including our sexuality, reproduction, intimate relationships. And that means not only dealing with sexually transmitted infection, but talking about consent, pleasure, intimate and interpersonal relationship, developing sex and hygiene training in space, talking and training astronauts to deal with the complexity of human eroticism and the messiness of our interpersonal relationships when it comes to love, romance, finding partners, and talking about consent, sexual harassment and violence as well, talking about gender diversity and inclusion, sexual orientation and preferences. I could go on about what would need to be included in these programs, including the development of technological systems that are compatible with the artificial ecosystems of spaceships, base and settlements to enable human eroticism. I could go on talking about what needs to be done, but again, it's obviously not just me. It needs to come as a first step from the space agency, who need to be courageous and honest about what they actually need for long space duration. And we need to bring people from all walks of life in this project and all kinds of expertise in these programs to tackle holistically human intimacy, eroticism, and sexuality.
How did you become interested in this topic? And how did you take it to the space industry? How did you bridge that gap between sex or sex technology and intimate relationships and space?
So I started by being interested in human-machine erotic interaction and sexology. So when we devised the robotics with my colleague, Dr. Devantil, and some of my also colleagues, Maria Santaguida, we were thinking of looking at the development of emerging technologies right now and how it was maybe reshaping human sexuality, how it was affecting it. And we realized that we needed to create a field to guide research, and we needed to bring sexology as a field to human-machine interaction. And as we tackled some of these questions, it became obvious that sex tech and robotics, like e-robots, like erotic chatbots, virtual partners, sex robot, could have direct application to widen access to intimacy and sexuality in sometimes contexts or environments that makes it difficult for people to find suitable partners, and also to sometimes maintain relationship with loved ones at a distance. So one thing became clear when we were looking at these different environments and the solution that could be applied was that space was one of these contexts, and astronauts was one of these populations that could probably benefit from robotic technologies and sex tech in general. So when we realized that, we decided to write an opinion piece in the conversation that we mentioned at the beginning, sex in space. Could technology meet the needs, the intimate needs of astronauts? And when we started researching last year the repercussions and implications of doing this, we actually realized that sexuality in general was not being addressed in space programs. When we realized that, we started researching furthermore last year, and further realized that other researchers had made claims in the past, going back up to the 90s, that we should be addressing human sexuality in space. And then again at the beginning of the 21st century, and then a couple years ago in 2016 and 2018. And obviously in the media, it was brought up often. And systematically, we realized that space agency were just not doing anything about it, other than, like I said, looking at reproduction and gender and sex differences. So my hope right now, we are writing a paper called Space Sexology, the case for the extraterrestrial, the scientific study of human sexuality, reproduction, and intimate relationship in space. My hope with this paper and the different media intervention that I'm doing right now with and other people is that these agencies, and they start listening. Okay, so I thank you first for inviting me here, because you're part of this. We need to bring this topic further and make the public, who's also paying and financing some of these institutions, understand that this is a very important issue and should not be treated as an afterthought by national and private space agencies.
Well, let's hope they listen. And I'd love to see this work develop over the next few years at least, because it is a very important topic. Okay, I'm going to end this on a very light note. So where in space would you like to go and have sex, and what kind of sex tech would you pack with you?
Yeah, good question. I'd say where I would want to go in space is probably maybe one of these Earth-like planets. Yeah, like Kepler. Maybe a Earth-like planet, or some planet that is in what we think is an habitable zone, because I think it's the kind of environment that would make it more likely to find life and maybe exchange knowledge or discover a new interesting thing about biology in space and sexuality in space, and how we can survive in these environments. So yeah, that's probably where I'd go, one of these Earth-like environments. What I would pack in terms of, I won't necessarily answer related to what I would pack, but I think anyone who's going to for a long space journey would probably be better off if they could bring some form of system that enables immersive and connected erotic experiences, including something, a couple of sex toys for sexual outlet, but also systems that would enable them maybe to connect with loved ones or partners on Earth, maybe for sexual and non-sexual purposes, but so you can think about goggles or virtual or augmented reality, maybe some form of haptic equipment that could enable body sensations, and maybe any form of system that can enable more complex communication with partners on Earth or on other space contexts like stations or ships. So it's not necessarily what I would bring, but I think everyone would probably be better off having some form of sex tech or immersive erotic systems with them to offset some of the issues related to not having sex or intimate relationship in space.
It's amazing. Thank you so much. Where can my viewers reach you and get in touch if they wanted to?
Yes, absolutely. You can reach me on Twitter at SciDub11, just by email at simondube.t@gmail.com.
That's Dube with an accent on the E, by the way, but obviously email won't give you that option, so just an E.
Just an E.
Yeah. Well, it's been incredible having you on the show, Simon. This is really interesting, and I'm surprised why it hasn't been discussed in depth or even implemented within large space agencies such as NASA. This is fascinating. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and your insights with me today.
Thank you so much for having me.